The Romanovs' last night, massacre, or escape? For more than 300 years, one family ruled Russia, the Romanovs. Then came 1917. The revolution ripped the crown off their heads and threw the empire into chaos. A year later, the world was told the unthinkable. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and all 5 of their children were murdered. But here's the question that refuses to die. Did everyone really die that night? Or did someone somehow escape? Because if even one Romanov survived, then one of history's most famous closed cases becomes a door left slightly open. The collapse of an empire. In 1914, Imperial Russia marched into World War I beside Britain and France. It went in proud. It came out shattered. Millions were dead. The country was starving. And by March 1917, Petrograd was exploding. People rioted for bread. Students flooded the streets. Workers struck. Troops were ordered to restore order. And then those troops mutinied. Nicholas II was rushed back from where he had taken personal command of the imperial armies. And then he was cornered. An ultimatum: abdicate. Nicholas renounced the throne his family had held since 1613 so simply, one stunned officer said, as if turning over a cavalry squadron to a new commanding officer. But in his diary, the Tsar wrote what he truly felt. All around me I see treason, cowardice, and deceit. House arrest at Tsarskoye Selo. The new provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, placed the former royal family under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo, the elegant palaces outside Petrograd. Inside that gilded cage were Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their son, the Tsarevich Alexei, and 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia aged 22 down to 16. At first, captivity was humiliating, but not brutal. They were watched, but they still lived. Nicholas chopped wood, planted vegetables, rode with his children, read to them at night. He was no longer a ruler. He was simply a father. And that devotion some believed helped doom him. Because in Russia, it was an open secret. Nicholas was deeply influenced by Alexandra. And Alexandra was haunted by one fragile fact. Their only son, Alexei, was a hemophiliac. A small injury could become a death sentence. So when Rasputin, the infamous monk, seemed to ease the boy's suffering, the royal couple clung to him. Then, on December 31, 1916, Rasputin was murdered by Russian noblemen, and the Romanovs lost the one man they believed could save their child. 2 months later, Nicholas lost the throne to Siberia for safety. By summer 1917, Kerensky feared danger from both sides. The Bolsheviks might kill the ex-Tsar. Monarchists might rescue him. So Kerensky chose exile. Tobolsk, a remote town in Siberia, more than 1,000 miles away, beyond the Urals. On August 14th, the family departed by heavily guarded train accompanied by about 40 servants. 2 days earlier they had celebrated Alexei's 13th birthday. It would be one of the last birthdays he ever had. The Bolsheviks take over. Then Kerensky fell. In November, the Bolsheviks seized power. In March 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But Russia's civil war was just beginning. White armies advanced. Red armies fought to survive. And Lenin now had a problem sitting in Siberia. What do you do with a living ex-Tsar while your enemies are marching toward him? In April 1918, Lenin ordered the Romanovs moved again, this time to Ekaterinburg, the House of Special Designation. In Ekaterinburg, local Bolsheviks took a solid 2-story home belonging to a merchant named Ipatiev, and they renamed it with a phrase that sounds like a warning, the House of Special Designation. The lower floor was partly underground kitchen and storage. Upstairs, 5 rooms for the family, their physician Dr. Eugene Botkin, and a few remaining servants. A wooden palisade blocked the house from view. The windows were whitewashed. No one could look in. No one could look out. The guards, mostly former factory workers, were led by Alexander Avdyev, often drunk, often cruel. He mocked Nicholas, calling him Nicholas the blood drinker. Meals were taken from a common pot. The guards sometimes reached in over the shoulders of the diners and helped themselves. The daughters were escorted even to the toilet, and the walls there were defaced with obscene drawings of Alexandra and Rasputin. Nicholas protested. Avdyev threatened him with hard labor. Meanwhile, Alexei grew weaker. So weak his father carried him outside to sit in a wheelchair. Nicholas was 50 now, white hairs in his beard, still dressing neatly in a simple khaki uniform. Alexandra, one guard said, looked grave and haughty. the night everything changed. In early July, Avdyev was replaced. His successor was Yakov Yurovsky, head of the local Bolshevik secret police. Nicholas wrote in his diary on July 10, "This specimen pleases me least of all." 2 days later, an emissary arrived from Moscow. The order was clear: do not let the ex-Tsar fall into white hands. The Whites were closing in. They were joined by a Czech force of 40,000. They advanced westward toward Ekaterinburg. Then came the final summons. Sometime after midnight, July 16th to 17th, 1918, Yurovsky awakened the family. He ordered them to dress. He led them downstairs to a ground floor room. He told them the Whites were fighting in the streets. A truck waited outside, engine running, to take them away. Chairs were brought for Nicholas, Alexandra, and the invalid Alexei. The 4 daughters stood. Dr. Botkin stood. 3 servants stood. Then Yurovsky read a death warrant issued by local Bolsheviks, and he raised his gun. He shot Nicholas in the head. That shot was the signal. The execution squad opened fire at their assigned targets. Those who didn't die instantly were finished with bayonets. Afterward, the bodies were thrown onto the truck. They were taken to a deserted mine outside the city. There, the remains were hacked apart, burned, soaked with acid, and thrown into a mine shaft. On July 17th, a coded message reached Moscow, informed Sverdlov that all the family have met the same fate as the head. Officially, family died during evacuation. The first doubts. A week later, the Whites seized Ekaterinburg. They launched an investigation, and the story that entered history: execution, bodies, destruction came largely from those findings. But then something happened that cracked the certainty. The first investigator concluded, yes, Nicholas had been executed, but he believed Alexandra, Alexei, and the 4 daughters had been spared. That conclusion wasn't useful. It didn't fully brand the Bolsheviks as monsters in the eyes of the world. So another investigation began in early 1919. A new investigator, a bigger conclusion. Sokolov's case. The new investigator was Nikolas Sokolov, responsible for cases of exceptional importance, and the Romanovs were the case of the century. Sokolov searched the mine site and found disturbing evidence: a tiny lock, a bent hairpin used as a fishhook by Alexei, gems sewn into undergarments, the carcass of Tatiana's lapdog, and a severed finger identified as Alexandra's. In 1924, Sokolov published his findings. His verdict was clear: the entire family died on July 16th to 17th, 1918. By then, many people were ready to believe it. The world accepted the Romanovs as martyrs. But the stories don't match. And yet your text presents contradictions that refuse to disappear. When the Bolsheviks announced Nicholas's execution on July 19th, they said Alexandra and the children had been taken to a safe place. That version was published in Ekaterinburg 4 days later. Even more curious, through the fall of 1918, the Bolsheviks negotiated with Germany to exchange Alexandra, a German princess by birth, and her children for Russian political prisoners. Then came Sir Charles Elliot, the British consul for Siberia. After speaking with the Whites' first investigator, Elliot told his superiors he believed Alexandra and the children had left Ekaterinburg by train on July 17. He believed massacre stories were fabrications. Around that same time, Alexandra's brother, Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse, sent word via neutral Sweden that Alexandra was safe-based, presumably on German intelligence. Still, the family never appeared. And after Sokolov's report, the belief in total murder hardened into truth. Over time, escape became fantasy. Suppressed evidence? Decades passed. Then, in the early 1970s, British journalists Anthony Summers and Tom Mangold, as presented in your text, discovered the official records of Sokolov's investigation. And they became convinced Sokolov may have omitted critical evidence or even falsified information. The most important piece? A coded telegram sent to Moscow on July 17th reporting the death of the entire family. But it was placed in the file only in January 1919, after the first investigator was removed and before Sokolov took over. So the question becomes, was the telegram genuine or conveniently inserted? There were other doubts too. An eyewitness who spoke freely to the Whites then died under suspicious circumstances, evidence that the first investigators found nothing at the mine site, yet Sokolov later found grim remains. A dog's carcass that, some argued, could not have survived a Siberian winter, and the possibility that animal remains could have been introduced later. And then there's the strangest claim of all. that a trail leads, not to a grave, but to a train. The trail to Perm. In late December 1918, the Whites marched into Perm, about 175 miles northwest of Ekaterinburg. A white officer learned that survivors of the massacre had allegedly been brought to Perm by train sometime after July 17. Key informants named in your text: a nurse, Natalia Mutnich; a doctor, Pavel Utkin. Interrogated 3 times in spring 1919, the nurse claimed she heard from her brother assistant to a leading Bolshevik that only Nicholas and Alexei were executed. She claimed Alexandra and the 4 daughters were taken to Perm for safety. She also claimed she had seen the imperial prisoners and knew of escape attempts by Tatiana and Anastasia. Dr. Utkin confirmed Anastasia's alleged escape attempt, and he described visiting a severely beaten young woman around September 20th who identified herself as the youngest Grand Duchess. Other witnesses recalled searches in the woods around Perm, possibly for escapees. Then, according to this version, about 3 weeks before the Whites took Perm, the Bolsheviks put the 5 women on another train, headed for Moscow, and there the trail ends. Grand Duchess or imposter. Then comes Berlin, February 17, 1920. A policeman pulled a young woman about 20 from a canal. She refused to identify herself. She was committed to a mental institution as Frulian Unbekannt Miss Unknown. Later, diagnosed with mental illness of a depressive character, she made a claim that would shake the world. She said she was Grand Duchess Anastasia. She claimed she alone escaped the massacre at Ekaterinburg. She wasn't the only alleged survivor. Other Anastasias surfaced. Even an Alexei appeared in Poland in the 1960s. But the Berlin woman who became known as Anna Anderson came closest to being believed. Romanov relatives in Europe were asked to meet her, only to agree. Nicholas's sister, Grand Duchess Olga; Alexandra's sister, Princess Irene of Prussia. They did not publicly confirm her identity. By 1928, 12 Romanovs and 3 of Alexandra's German siblings rejected her as an imposter. And yet, she still had supporters. Tatiana Botkin, daughter of Dr. Botkin, believed her. One of Irene's sons prepared questions only Anastasia should answer, and Anna's replies convinced him. Even Irene later admitted there was a striking resemblance. And Olga? Years later, it was revealed Olga had wavered. Their meeting took place in October 1925 in a Berlin hospital. At their parting, Anna cried. Olga kissed her cheeks and promised to write. Olga reportedly said, "My reason cannot grasp it, but my heart tells me that the little one is Anastasia." Letters followed until Christmas, then silence. And in January 1926, denial. Anna Anderson never convincingly explained her escape. Her story that she survived bullets and bayonets and was rescued by a guard who became her lover sounded to many like fiction. Even a famous film did not settle it. West German courts ultimately ruled as presented in your text that her claim could neither be proved nor refuted. Closing voiceover beat. So what happened in that house in Ekaterinburg? A massacre carefully erased? Or an execution story that concealed something else? Because the Romanovs didn't just leave behind a fallen throne. They left behind a question. A question strong enough to survive revolutions, wars, courts, books, and decades of denial. Did someone walk out of the house of special designation alive?